Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 101 Inches Open-Minded Alice. Duncan looked at Alice expressionlessly as if he were staring at a retard. The striking calm gaze of the Frost Queen from half a century ago was still entrenched in his mind, but the afterimage that should have been confusing was now attacked by Alice, a mentally disabled puppet. Forget the silliness. The mere fact that she was plucking on and unplugging her head from the neck was enough to drive anyone mad. Eventually, Duncan's sanity snapped. What are you doing? Ah, Captain. Alice reacted later than she should. Quickly plopping her head back on. Oh, I think there are a few hairs caught in my neck join, so. Duncan's face turned deadpan. If you keep pulling your head off like that, then you better start thinking up new names for your hair. I already came up with some. If they fall, they'll be called Williamson. It took Duncan a lot of effort to control his urge to yell and refrain from throwing the doll out of the cabin. After a few seconds, he let out a long sigh and gradually calmed down. To be fair, Alice's appearance does bring a bit of joy to the lifeless ghost ship, but sometimes it's just too much silliness. Even the goat head couldn't keep up with the puppet's rhythm sometimes, so forget about Duncan, who could barely make the ins and outs of this one's brain. Who knows, the doll's head might be solid wood inside. Duncan's gaze swept over Alice, recalling back to the echo he saw in the past. He could be sure that it was the legendary Frost Queen Raynora that he saw, and the source of the lapse came from the puppet coffin. But what is the essence of those pictures? Is the coffin consciously telling me something? Are they passively recorded images? Or is it the memory of Anomaly 099? Is it a real fragment of history? Or is there an illusion that's been distorted and corrected to a certain extent? He thought about the calm gaze the young queen made when facing him, then recalled the plea as well. Whoever you are, please don't pollute history. Ads by PubFuture. To whom is this phrase addressed? Is it really me? Do her words cross over space and time itself? Or is it just a part of the illusionary echo that reacted when I tapped into it? And that voice asking the queen who she is talking to, who is that? This succession of reactions was so real that it would give shivers to anyone who experienced it. As for the end of the echo, those sounds coming from the darkness also made Duncan particularly wary. Queen Frost was executed by the rebels, and one of her crimes turned out to be the vain attempt of trying to let the vanished re-enter the real world, and building a second vanished. There was also a hidden abyss plan, which seemed to be the reason for the rebellion. But these things, he had never heard the goat head mentioned before. That statue on the mapping table would often recite some great deeds of the vanished to him. Such as how many ships were swallowed on which route or how much commotion it caused in which city-state, although 8 out of 10 of his words were unreliable. If a city-state ruler did collude with the vanished, then there's no way the goat head would have omitted that story. That blabbermouth wouldn't be able to hold it in if something that big did occur. Unless the incident is false, a crime made up by the rebels to the queen. Captain, are you all right, Captain? Alice's voice suddenly came from the side, interrupting Duncan's cranky thoughts. Duncan exhaled softly, forcing down the chaotic thoughts in his mind before turning to face the doll. He couldn't ignore how similar Alice and the Frost Queen looked, but the air and temperament were nothing alike. It's okay. I just saw a little record saved by the coffin. He shook his head to dispel the strange emotion. Record. Alice's eyes widened in curiosity. What kind of record is it? The scene relating to the decapitation of the Frost Queen half a century ago, Duncan said lightly. I met her, she's exactly like you. Alice immediately subconsciously touched her neck over that remark. The puppet lady didn't know whether to feel nervous or not. After a long struggle, she finally spoke without holding back. Could it be that I am really the Frost Queen? After being beheaded, I did not die, but was affected by supernatural powers and became what I am now. Duncan thought for a while and replied truthfully. If you don't speak, don't move, and just lie quietly in this box, I would agree with your theory. However, Alice was quick to pick up on the sentence and raised a brow. However, she quickly put this doubt behind her and turned to face the coffin. Then did anything change after you burned it with fire? Did you manage to control it? Duncan shoots a sideway glance at the wooden box and confirms the deep connection has faded, but the traces of his flame does remain. It's similar to what he has with the sun talisman, more complex and subtle though. Simply said, he had no idea how to control Alice's wooden box. In fact, he doubts there's even an option to control this thing. Nevertheless, one thing's certain, this coffin was very stable and tamed, now that it's a part of the vanished. Ads by PubFuture. I'm not sure. Maybe we need further testing to know if it's safe. More testing is needed to determine if the decapitation effect comes from the coffin or from you. Duncan shook his head, but for now, I feel it's fit to leave it alone and assume it's like the other items on the ship. As he spoke, he turned his head to look at the puppet beside him. The key now is you. Do you feel any different? Alice pointed to herself in bewilderment. Me? I don't. Why do you ask that? You and your wooden box are one. Both together adds up to make anomaly 099. Now that I usurped the authority of the coffin with my flames, I may have affected you to a certain extent. Duncan looked at Alice very seriously. He knew that the doll was slow to react, so he gradually got used to telling her the words needed: move your body, tell me if something is wrong. Alice reacted consciously and quickly got up to check herself. Ran around the room twice, doing some jumping jacks, and finally hooked her finger in a summoning manner at her wooden box. The box did not move. It's not obeying. Alice was shocked and finally found the big problem: I normally only need to flick my finger to make it float. Duncan's heart jolted at this discovery. He did seem to feel some response from the coffin when Alice flicked her finger, but the coffin was awaiting his orders then. Raising his eyebrow, Duncan suddenly felt a little embarrassed. Maybe it is due to being in contact with my flame. The coffin has already regarded me as a higher master. Quote. Alice jerked around to make a dumbfounded face at the captain, then her expression visibly turned aggrieved like a child that had its precious toy ripped from her. But it's okay. I can lift my restrictions on it. Duncan found it more awkward when he saw the pitiful face of the doll and quickly waved his hand. It will still obey your orders. Alice was stunned, then turned her head to hook her finger at the wooden box again. This time, she finally got the response she desired. The puppet lady immediately smiled and allowed her precious coffin to fall back to the ground before throwing herself into a hug with the lid. Great. I thought you wouldn't obey me in the future anymore. Duncan almost couldn't control his expression at the swift change in emotions. Sometimes, I really envy your open-minded attitude to life. Alice looked up, confused by the captain's sentence. Forget it, just be happy. Duncan sighed. Are you sure there's nothing wrong with you? No. Alice examined herself. There was nothing uncomfortable at all, and it feels like it's better than before. Better than before. I can't quite say what, but I think my body is relaxed. Peace of mind. Alice thought for a moment, trying to find words to describe her feelings. It's a bit like the feeling of reassurance when I used to lie in the box, but now I feel just as reassured standing outside the box. The puppet thought while talking and then flailed her hands up before the man could analyze the issue. It doesn't matter. It's not a bad thing anyway. Chapter 102 Inches Goat Head's Nemesis. Duncan had to hand it to this Gothic-styled doll. Alice not only calmly accepted the fact that her box had been transformed into a part of the vanished, she also tossed the idea of her being the Frost Queen to the back of her head in no time flat. It's a level of open-mindedness that Duncan cannot match. According to Miss Doll, she was so calm because it was beyond her control. So whatever happened in the past did, and she's not going to dwell on the issue since she's here now. I'm staying on this ship now anyway, and I'm not going to leave in the future. It's not a big deal for the box to become part of the vanished. As for the matter with the Frost Queen, that's even simpler. I don't even know her. Alice sat back down on the lid of her wooden box with a pleasant smile on her face. I don't know if I'm her, and I don't know what kind of person she used to be. Regardless, it was half a century ago. Let bygones remain bygones. It's just history now. It's good that you have a big heart. Duncan just looked at Alice's lilac eyes, then slightly nodded after a long silence. In the end, he remained hesitant about mentioning what the Frost Queen said to him during the execution scene. After all, even if it was mentioned, this puppet most likely knows nothing. It's good that she's so carefree instead. Let's leave it here. We now have a preliminary understanding and control of your coffin. Whether the decapitation effect is from you or the coffin, that will need to be tested further at a later date. Duncan exhaled softly. I'll go first. Captain, you go slowly. Leaving Alice's room, Duncan returned to the deck, where he gradually came to the captain's quarter. He's sorting through all the things he learned and needs some time alone. He originally wanted to find out whether the decapitation power of Anomaly 099 was controllable, but in the end he failed to solve this problem and accidentally touched upon the incident from half a century ago, the Frost Queen, executed by the rebels, accusations of collusion with the Vanished, and a mysterious hidden abyss plan. These things swirled in his mind and wouldn't disappear. And in addition to these, there was another thing that concerned him. Duncan reached out and took something out of his arms. It was a small hairpin shaped like a silvery white feather surrounded by waves. In any case, it doesn't look like something that a rough male seafarer would have. In addition, he kept getting this vague nostalgia when staring at this hairpin. It seems to have a special meaning for the once real Captain Duncan. Ads by PubFuture. Duncan's mind had questions, but he knew that the goat head could not answer the matter. Putting away the hairpin, he entered the mapping room, where the goat head was diligently controlling the ship. To Duncan's surprise, the dove eye, who was supposed to stay in the bedroom, was with the statue and standing atop of the thing's horn while chirping merrily. When did you two have such a good relationship? He asks curiously. The bird flapped its wings and did not open its mouth, but the goat head with his obsidian eyes clearly showed a glint of desperation. Oh great captain, can you get some fries the next time you take a spirit walk? Duncan was stunned. Why are you starting with the whole make some fries thing? The goat head voice almost trembled as it grimaced. Please, bring some fries back, if not to keep the bird's mouth shut. Duncan looked at the combination of bird and goat with complexity. After a good minute of confusion and amazement, he suddenly chuckled in amusement. So you finally met your arch nemesis. I went through 76 topics. 76. I exhausted my lifelong learning experience, gone through thousands of years of history, and issued poems of wonders, yet all I ever get in response is make some fries from this dove. The goat head exclaims in agony, his voice quivering with defeat. How do you ever communicate with this bird? Simple, just talk to it less. If you don't talk to it, it will quickly quiet down. Duncan spread his hands out. I guess you can't. The goat head thought for a moment and sighed. Then I guess it's better if we stick to making some fires. Duncan was noncommittal and only beckoned for I to come over. Fluttering her wings, the dove landed on his shoulder and casually chirped in delight. Nodding at the bird for doing a good job, the ghost captain returns his attention to the goat head, the ruler of the Frost City State from half a century ago, Frost Queen Rey Nora. Do you know anything about her? Frost Queen, the one that was executed by the rebels half a century ago. The goat head was stunned for a moment. I've heard about it, and it seems that we fought with them decades ago, but aside from this, there's nothing else to say. Why did you bring this up all of a sudden? Duncan calmly peered into the goat head's eyes and knew there were no lies in the first mate's words. Goathead really didn't know about the Frost Queen, and the Vanished had no connection with the Frost City State. Not only was there no contact, but the Vanished even clashed with the guards of that city-state, just as it clashed with ships from other city-states and other shipping routes. In that case, it can only mean the rebels made up the story of the Frost Queen colluding with the Vanished. The entire crime is fictional nonsense. Of course, it may be too early to draw this conclusion. After all, the event did occur over half a century ago. There may be twists and turns buried within history that no one knows about. The first mate may be telling the truth, but that doesn't mean the truth represents the entire picture. Ads by PubFuture. Duncan doesn't intend to overturn the case for the Frost Queen from half a century ago. He just wants to know about the Vanished and Alice. Did you know? Alice's appearance is exactly the same as the Frost Queen, and the so-called Anomaly 099 is most likely born after the executed Frost Queen became cursed by the boundless sea, he said casually while teasing the dove on his shoulder with his fingers. And the main crime of the Frost Queen when she was executed by the rebels was collusion with the Vanished. The goat head appeared taken aback, a sight rarely seen thus far. Colluding with the Vanished. Do the foolish humans have to make up such a ridiculous reason for even betraying their monarch? After a few seconds, the goat head finally broke out laughing. He obviously thought it was ridiculous, Don't blame me for laughing, Captain, those humans are just too stupid and weak. I wouldn't put it past them to blame the vanished if they go out and drop on their head. Speaking of this, he paused before continuing, but you say that Miss Alice looks a lot like the Frost Queen. This is really incredible. If Miss Alice was really transformed from the Frost Queen, that's a lot of irony in the story. Yes, if they really have this connection, it is ironic. Duncan leaned back against his chair using a comfortable position. The Frost Queen had never been in contact with the vanished during her lifetime, yet she was charged by the rebels using collusion as an excuse. Now, half a century later, Alice really did become the crew of the vanished, the very crime those rebels placed on her head. No wonder you rushed to find Miss Alice when you came back. Turns out you found some key information regarding Anomaly 099. The goat head immediately began to flatter the ghost captain. It's really worthy of the great Captain Duncan to return with a heaping mountain of booty. This reminds me, a navigator once said, or maybe a. Duncan immediately glared at the goat head to halt the rambling. Then taking the bird off his shoulder, he places eye down next to the statue. You two talk. Goat's head, comma. In the central cathedral of the city-state of Planned, Vanna handed a document she had just signed to her entourage. Send this document to the Western Church, this is the last search warrant. The young guardian took the file and bowed. Yes, Inquisitor. Vanna exhaled softly, cracking her neck due to the stiff job of reading all day with the paperwork. She's feeling more tired than wielding the greatsword she used to behead those heretics. I hope there won't be any more trouble tonight. The young lady Inquisitor couldn't help but grumble while stretching her waist. As if in response to her mutter, a slightly urgent and sharp bell suddenly rang from the direction of the main building. The guardian, who didn't have time to leave yet, stopped and glanced at the window in the direction of the main church. How come the hour clock is ringing at night? What could have happened? It's the summoning bell. Vanna quickly discerned the message based on the rhythm and timing of each ring. 7 consecutive short rings. It's coming from the tomb of the nameless king. Could it be the discovery of a new anomaly or vision? Chapter 103 Inches Tomb of the Unknown King. The bell rang 3 more times before Vanna arrived at the main cathedral, where she was promptly met by old Bishop Valentine. The old priest wore his status's black wardrobe and silently prayed to the storm goddess Gomona's statue. Inquisitor Vanna, Valentine said in a deep voice, the Cathedral of Storms has sent an order to summon the listeners. Sent directly from the Storm Cathedral. Taken aback, Vanna hurried over to the statue and immersed herself in the lamp's glow. Isn't the bell ring for a discovery of a new anomaly or vision? If it was a new discovery, the bell would not have rang 3 times in a row. Valentine shook his head. It was the gravekeeper on the other side of the tomb who sent us the news. There's movement from the unknown king. Although it was unclear what message he was trying to convey, it appears though, the existing list is changing. As he spoke, the old bishop turned his head and quietly stared into Vanna's eyes. This time, we need to send a listener into the tomb to get direct instruction from the unknown king. The current rotation is with us, which means the Storm Church will be providing the candidate among the faithful. It's not decided who will enter yet, but you and I are on the waiting list. Vanna fixed her mind and asked calmly, when do we leave? Now, Valentine nodded, motioning for the lady to follow. They headed behind the statue, where a door with sacred symbols was already open and waiting. Inside revealed a deep and long passage. The psionic passage is ready. Vanna first bowed to the statue, then followed the old bishop forward. The 2 devout followers passed through flickering lights in this long passageway until they eventually arrived at their destination. Here, a special secret room has been erected. Unlike the cement and brick structure of the main body of the cathedral, this small chamber was made entirely of stone piled up together to form the wall and the roof. At the center was a sunken fire pit that burned with a crackling flame. However, there was no fuel to speak of, only a flame that seemed to be conjured up from thin air. There was no furniture to speak of either, only the subtle sound of running water from nowhere. Every wall around them seemed to be wet to emphasize this detail, and even the floor had tiny streams of water flowing along the stone cracks. This gave the impression that this chamber was not some room in the cathedral, but rather, a waterlogged cave at the bottom of the sea. This would not be the first time that Vanna had come here. As an inquisitor of the city-state with a status equal to the bishop, she also has the right to use the psionic passage here. This seemingly inconspicuous room was the portal that connects the psionic channel. Ads by PubFuture. In every city-state's central cathedral, similar facilities are hidden away during their construction. Every recognized religion in this world had something similar. In this case, the priests of the storm goddess called this chamber the flooded caves. Of course, there are other names out there too. For the death priests that worship the god of death and life, they built something called the burial chambers, with a more gloomy and oppressive atmosphere. Regardless of the naming and style though, they all served one purpose: to send the occupant's spirit into an extensive interconnecting network of the soul. This way, no matter how far or wide one was from the other, they could still communicate through the boundless sea. A miracle blessed by the gods. If not for this ability to communicate across vast stretches of water, the world as they knew it might not be here today. Back then, sailing across the sea wasn't so easy, and ships would often sink or lose their way. The door of the secret chamber slowly closed, and the dark and heavy metal barrier made a dull and heavy sound as the intricate runes intermingled and meshed together to form a seal. No living creatures could leave or enter after the seal completes. Vanna and Valentine stood together by the fire pit in the center. They bowed their heads, gazing at the leaping holy flame as they chanted the storm goddess's name. The illusory sound of water continued to come from all sides at first, then it grew, and grew, until droplets became waves, and waves became tsunamis. At the same time, mists had overtaken the entire chamber following the flame's increased ferocity. There was no visibility to speak of anymore, only plain white of churning gas and water. Vanna closed her eyes knowing the next step: she needed to allow herself to be submerged in this water. The cold touch quickly dissipated as her consciousness receded. By the time she opened those eyes again, she was no longer inside that watery cave but in a vast square that was cordoned off by crumbling stone pillars. She could see beyond the square of course, but all there was were muddled, chaotic sparks in the horizon. As to what they represented, who knows? At least Vanna didn't have a clue. Focusing her mind after the brief distraction, Vanna saw that there were already many figures standing in the square. All of them were black phantoms with only silhouettes visible. Despite not seeing their faces, the familiar aura coming from each figure confirmed to the lady they were devout saints of the storm goddess. People like her who wielded great power over in the other city-states. Some were even stationed in the constantly moving main storm cathedral out on the boundless sea. It seems that we are the latest to arrive, a dark phantom approached flickeringly. Vanna didn't need to wait for the shadow to introduce to know it's Valentine. I was also the last to arrive during the last meeting. Do the saints of the other city-states live in the secret chamber? Vanna muttered. Every time the news of the summoning comes out, they would always somehow get here minutes before us. Ever since St. Fulson wrote, first, in the register of the Assembly Hall 20 years ago, they have all begun to compete in arriving early. Valentine shook his head. Seriously, it's incomprehensible. The goddess will not drop special attention to the individual because of this anyway. Vanna couldn't agree more with Valentine's logic. Then out of the blue, a sudden boom came from the end of the crowd, interrupting everyone's thoughts and conversation. Vanna and Valentine looked up simultaneously and were surprised to find the ground at the square center rising. The broken old stone brick was rippling like a wave of water. Within the layers of ripples, behemoths were growing rapidly upwards. First it was the pale spires, followed by sloping stone walls and quaint columns. Ads by PubFuture. Almost instantly, the object was completed before Vanna's vision, a huge building made of pale boulder blocks. It was a dull palace, an ancient building constructed during the Lost Eras. It had a pyramid as the main body with several obelisks and towers around it. No other city-state in the world was of this style, and its low and oppressive atmosphere did not at all resemble a building for the living. It wasn't so much a palace but a mausoleum. In fact, it was indeed a mausoleum belonging to some ancient and powerful civilization. Like everyone else, Vanna's gaze involuntarily fell on the bottom of the huge pyramid. Under the gaze of countless eyes, the mausoleum's door finally slowly opened. The heavy pale stone gate retreated to the sides, and an extremely tall figure slowly walked out of the mausoleum. It was the gravekeeper of the tomb for the unknown king. In Vanna's view, it was difficult to say that he was still a living human. The gravekeeper's body was wrapped in layers of bandaged fabric, half charred a pitch black and the other half hanging with chains of runic shackles. Some of the shackles had even penetrated into the flesh to become one with the gravekeeper, effectively becoming bones and nerve endings. This ancient being was like a terrifying mummy from ancient Egypt, but more warped and cursed in appearance. Although it was not the first time seeing this important gravekeeper, Vanna still subconsciously took a second to inhale deeply to get her muscles to ease up. Then she saw the gravekeeper walking straight towards her. The candidate has been chosen. Without hesitation, the being passed everyone in the square until he stopped in front of Vanna. Through the black bandages and runic chains, the lady could tell the gravekeeper was watching her with that single exposed red eye. "You can enter the tomb." The gravekeeper spoke, his voice hoarse as if coming from a corpse. Then he raised his right hand, which seemed to be charred by fire, and grasped onto a quill that flew out of the tomb with a parchment in tow. "Make a note of what you hear," the gravekeeper commanded succinctly. Chapter 104 Inches Notes. Looking at the quill and parchment handed to her by the gravekeeper, Vanna took a small breath to allow her emotions to settle down. "How long can I go in for?" She raised her head and asked the gravekeeper with firm eyes. The mummy-like figure lowered his head slightly and gave off an air of something that was neither dead nor alive. "A moment, or eternity," the icy cold voice says. This answer implies that the message to be conveyed from the tomb was short and singular. At the same time, it could also be very dangerous and cause the listener's death. Vanna nodded lightly and withdrew her gaze from the gravekeeper. "There's no need to hesitate now that it's come to this." The lady marched towards the huge mausoleum with only the decaying rattling of chains behind her to signal the gravekeeper's following. In front of the large slab of stone representing the entrance, Vanna stopped and gazed upwards to take in the desolate atmosphere. It was not the first time she had seen the tomb during a psionic assembly, but this would be the first time she had the privilege of seeing it up close as a listener. Vision 004, Mausoleum of the Unknown King. This ancient tomb located in a strange gap between time and space was not a vision controlled by the Storm Church, but rather an ancient thing that's guarded and shared by the various Orthodox Church in rotation. From outside appearances alone, it was a mausoleum styled after the ancient kingdom of Crete. The available evidence from multiple texts also supports this theory. However, no one knows exactly who was responsible for building this place. What was known by the people though was that the owner would occasionally convey messages to the outside world through this ritual. As seen here, the ritual would begin by sending a gravekeeper out to pick a listener. If there wasn't a suitable candidate present in the square, a random person would then be brought in from the outside world at will. In the age when Vision 004 had not yet been tamed, such random callings had taken the lives of hundreds, if not thousands. That was until a saint appeared 1,000 years ago. The brave soul not only broke the terrible cycle of death, he also returned alive to announce the first gift of the unknown king, the original ranking list of anomalies and visions. Then through repeated attempts and failures, the various churches finally figured out the sequential pattern Vision 004 uses. After that, this once lethal phenomenon had become something of an asset, a relatively safe means to gain intel that would otherwise be impossible to get without huge sacrifices. Enter the mausoleum and prepare to listen. The low, hoarse voice of the gravekeeper came from behind her, pushing Vanna forward out of her stupor. Ads by PubFuture. The sound of the stone door gradually closed behind the Inquisitor, and the aura of the gravekeeper dissipated as well and reintegrated into the tomb. Vanna's alone now. Whatever happens, it's up to her to figure out. Pale flames burned on both sides of the corridor leading into the tomb. As Vanna walked along the illuminated path, her gaze swept across the walls and could vaguely make out the words that were clearly carved through fingernails. Go straight forward, cannot turn back. Do not ask the gravekeeper for the identity and name of the tomb owner. Do not run, do not shout, do not pray to any god. Be humble and reverent, but do not bow down. After entering the tomb, do not speak. These were records left by the countless past listeners over the years. In ancient times, the vast majority of those who entered this graveyard would die, with only 1% living long enough to leave behind these messages. Vanna knew every single line by heart, for they are something every saint of the church must learn. Precious gifts from her predecessors. But then Vanna suddenly came down with a curious question after reading these lines. She's heard of the warnings, but what about the other messages by those who have fallen into despair? They must have left something behind as well in desperation, right? Human nature is a complex thing. Before the major churches successfully controlled Vision 004, the gravekeepers brought hundreds of people here, if not thousands, without the world's knowledge. Among them were mere commoners without training. There's no way an ordinary citizen could withstand the cursed madness of being trapped inside a vision. Yet, she only saw the messages of those with a noble and resolute soul. Vanna was a little confused in her heart, but in the end, she did not call the gravekeeper to divulge her doubts. In theory, she could talk to the gravekeeper if she dared to, which does not violate the rules of the mausoleum. However, that doesn't mean there aren't risks involved. As the number rule in this world, never assume predictability regarding the supernatural. Adds by PubFuture. Heaving a long sigh to settle her mood, the lady marched forward until she was at the end of the corridor. A wide and quaint burial chamber appeared in her eyes. In the huge pyramid-like room, the pale stone walls sloping on all sides are carved with indistinct patterns. 2 rows of black-brown metal braziers are also distributed on both sides of the entrance, each burning with pale white flames that gave off a hazy gray smoke. However, there weren't any coffins like one would expect of a tomb, only a throne made of stone with its owner sitting on it. It was a headless body, which seemed to be a tall male based on the figure size. His limbs were firmly bound by chains, his arms and chest covered with thick black hair like that of animals, and his feet were deformed and twisted. There are also black scorched marks, indicating the body had suffered some sort of severe burn during the years. The body sat quietly on the throne, seemingly unresponsive to Vanna's visit. Remembering what she had studied, the lady quickly took out her parchment and quill the moment she saw the unknown king. Part of her was getting ready to record what she was going to hear, and the other part concentrated on repelling whatever mental pollution that might. Then Vanna jerked open her eyes again. She didn't know why or how, but she's currently outside the tomb on her back and staring upwards. There's the familiar crumbling pillars, the chaotic sky, and the gathered group of shadows of her peers in the distance coming over. You're awake, leave now. The hoarse and deep voice of the gravekeeper suddenly came from the side, causing Vanna to swing her eyes over to see what was happening. The tall mummy-like figure started to walk inside the tomb again, followed promptly by the loud sound of the mausoleum sinking back into the ground. Before Vanna could even begin comprehending, several of her peers had already made it to her side. The most obvious was Bishop Valentine, who helped the lady up by the waist. Vanna, are you all right? I saw you come out of the mausoleum and directly faint at the entrance. Vanna stammered as she stumbled to hold herself upright. The feeling of having her body drained of strength remained, but life was quickly returning, so it didn't take long for the mind to clear up. How long have I been in there? Only an instant, said one of the shadows of another saint. You entered the tomb, then the gate closed shut, and you came out again immediately. Vanna appeared startled and looked to Bishop Valentine for confirmation, which was reaffirmed by the old man's question, what about the parchment? Did you write down what you heard? Oh yes, parchment. Vanna was now fully awake and quickly realized she was still holding onto the parchment. But the next second later, her expression froze as she read the content. The original piece of parchment now only had a corner left due to being shredded, about a few centimeters long, and there's only a few words scrawled on it. Anomaly 099 Puppet Doll. Chapter 105 inches after the dissolution of the assembly. Anomaly 099 Puppet Doll. This was the only information on the parchment after Vanna returned from the tomb of the unknown king. The moment she saw those scrawled letters, the lady's expression visibly slowed to a crawl due to how lacking it was. On top of this, she could feel Bishop Valentine and several others beside her appear stunned as well. After a short silence, the black shadow of one of the saints suddenly spoke in a deep voice. An existing anomaly has been changed out of the civilized world's awareness. Quote. It fell into the hands of the vanished. The other saint nodded afterward. It could be that the ghost captain did something. But what kind of change will this produce as a result? The saint who spoke before looked worried. The difference between puppet coffin and puppet doll is not just a few letters. This change directly alarmed the tomb of the unknown king, and even caused the gravekeeper to summon the listeners to convey this information. Several saints solemnly discussed this in low voices, their eyes converging on Vanna, who had gradually recovered by now. She got up with the help of Bishop Valentine and eyed the only piece of paper left in her hand. I don't remember anything about what happened in the tomb. I only remember walking through the tomb myself. It is normal to forget the experience of being in the tomb. This is the reason for the parchment and quill from the gravekeeper, to record useful information from the experience, Bishop Valentine said slowly. But there are only these few words on the remaining parchment, it's abnormal and not right. Vanna looked at her hands stunnedly, and for a long time, she didn't know what to say. Was the parchment torn by me? Theoretically, it could only be you. Bishop Valentine firmly looked at his peer. There will be no one else in the mausoleum. The gravekeeper never interferes with the listener's communication with the tomb owner, and the tomb owner will not do anything superfluous except to convey the intended detail. Vanna's heart was full of confusion, but before she could continue speaking, a low and solemn feminine voice suddenly interrupted from the edge of the square. The time for the end of the assembly is approaching. The saints immediately stood rigid and turned at the source. Likewise, Vanna swiftly corrected her mindset and took on a formal stance at the woman wearing a gorgeous dress. Ads by PubFuture. The female figure was not followed by any entourage, instead she stood alone with an air of authority. In addition, this person wasn't just some shadowy silhouette like the other souls present, rather her image was condensed and faintly showed the outline of her face. Vanna respectfully bowed in awe at the leader of the Storm Church, the papal crown of the main Storm Cathedral. Not only was the lady the representative of the storm goddess in the mortal world, her very soul had undergone qualitative changes, hence the ability to take on the complete human appearance here. Well done, Saint Vanna, the Pope nodded and spoke with her majestic but gentle voice that soothed the lady's frustrated mood. How much information a listener can bring out of the tomb has always been an uncontrollable thing, and many times, the information that listeners bring out is not limited to the parchment. You mean? Asked Vanna with a bewildered but curious face. The less detail that remains on the parchment, the more dangerous the conveyed message must be from the tomb owner. It is your soul's instinctive drive to protect yourself and everyone here. Do not blame yourself for this outcome. The pieces of information are sufficient for the Storm Cathedral to use as a reference for charting the next voyage and to pray for guidance from our Lord. Sure enough, Vanna's heart and mind gradually settled down after listening to the Pope's soothing words. She knew that this was not an unintended effect, rather it was the Pope's deliberate act of helping herself through the power of words and blessing. Disperse first, the graceful lady said softly, and this gathering is over. The Storm Cathedral will carefully assess the message conveyed by Vision 004 this time. If necessary, I will issue a parable order or re-summon the saints at a later date. Vanna quickly bowed in gratitude before dissipating into the chaotic space, followed promptly by the others who disappeared one after the other from the square. In the huge assembly ground, the only one remaining now was the storm Pope Helena and the crumbling pillars supporting the chaotic skies. She did not move, only standing there motionlessly until a rippling effect occurred to her side. A tall, thin figure appeared in her line of sight. The new arrival seemed to be wearing a robe. Like Helena, his appearance was faintly recognizable and not just a vague shadow. It's that of an old and serious old man. Immediately afterward, another figure appeared next to this old fella, a short and old Gramps as well with a kind smile. Banster, Helena nodded at the tall, thin, serious old man, then looked at the smiling and chubby old fella. Loon, when did the two of you get so free? Don't the Death Church and Academy of Truth have to patrol the border? The border has been stable recently, with reliable surveillance. The tall, thin old man known as Banster said succinctly. Ads by PubFuture. For the time being, we have entrusted the task of patrolling the border to a reliable person to do it for us. The short and chubby old man named Loon also nodded. This time I mainly came to see the situation on your side. It seems that the civilized world is not very peaceful. The last time a similar situation occurred in the mausoleum was also when the Storm Church was in charge of the tomb, Banster said expressionlessly, about 100 years ago. That's obvious, Helena said lightly. The last time would of course be 100 years ago. That time I was the listener who entered. I wasn't helming the Storm Cathedral yet, so I remember it very well. Yes, I remember it very well too. When you went in, the short and chubby Loon stroked his beard and recalled with emotion. You were also thrown out of the mausoleum immediately after you entered, and it took a long time to wake up just like the little girl today. The parchment you brought out of the tomb was only a small note too, and there were only a few scrawled letters on it. Helena, remember what message you brought out of the tomb a century ago? The helmsman of the Storm Cathedral went silent for a moment before replying softly, I remember it very well, Vision 005 the Vanished. Loon nodded. That's right, you were the first to bring back news that the Vanished turned into a vision. The few letters you brought back at that time were confirmed in just 1 month when the phantom ship whistled past the necropolis of the Death Church. Poor Banster here had to watch his newly built ships back then be swallowed into the void without getting the chance to cut the ribbon for their maiden voyage. The leader of the Death Church, Pope Banster, glanced at Loon expressionlessly after having the sore subject brought up. Helena didn't seem to hear Loon's last words, only standing there in deep thought before speaking. Whether it is puppet or puppet coffin, it is just an anomaly, ranked in the lower 100, there's no comparison with something ranked 5th on the list. Yes, there is no comparison between the two, but you also know that the crux of the matter is not the information left on the note, but the parts that were left out. The expression on Loon's face finally became serious. The name of Anomaly 099 changed from being Puppet Coffin to Doll Puppet is nothing special in itself, but we all know it's never that simple. The details that are missing are always the most fatal. The clue to go on is that the matters related to that phantom ship, Helena said, but the other day when I asked the Lord for enlightenment. Speaking of this, she suddenly stopped and shook her head, seemingly not planning to continue the topic. Why didn't Frem come today? She looked at the two figures in front of her. Isn't he always the nosiest of us here? Frem and his church of flame bearers are busy with a very important matter, the short and chubby Loon said with a smile. The leaders of the 4 Orthodox churches can't all come here at the same to make a splash. Something important. Helena raised an eyebrow. What is he doing? Patrolling the border, Banster said succinctly. Helena. Chapter 106 Inches Duncan's Gift. The illusory sea water quickly dissipated like a dream at dawn when Vanna's spirit returned to her physical body. After a deep breath, she opened her eyes and saw that she was still standing in the rock chamber that looked like a cave under the sea, the magical flame still burning before her eyes. Looking to her side, the lady saw that Bishop Valentine was also coming out of it, evidence that she had truly attended the psionic gathering. Subconsciously clenching her hand, she wanted to confirm if the parchment was still there. But of course, that's not possible since the item only existed in the spirit world and couldn't be brought outside. We have just issued a notice informing the captains that the puppet coffin is out of control, Bishop Valentine sighed, and now we will have to reissue a new notice to correct the mistake. Vanna rubbed her wrist and looked at the bishop thoughtfully. The question is, how will we write the announcement? We don't know anything except the name change for Anomaly 099. The old bishop did not speak for a while, apparently he also believed this to be a difficult problem. Vanna brought back the news from Vision 004, but the news only pertained to the name change. Perhaps she had indeed heard more detailed information from the tomb owner, but that's been deliberately left out so it's never coming out. At this stage, we can only first announce the situation that Anomaly 099 has been renamed from Puppet Coffin to Puppet Doll. At the same time, modify all the characteristics of Anomaly 099 too. There may be changes, Valentine said after a long silence. It is an anomaly within the 100 ranks. There will be a chain reaction once triggered. Likely, the sealing conditions are also different now. If we continue to treat it as the old version, something bad and big will surely happen. Vanna nodded silently. For a while, the watery chamber grew eerily awkward without any of the two speaking. Eventually, after an unknown amount of time, the lady finally broke the tension. All visions and anomalies are numbered from Vision 04's messages, right? Of course, Valentine nodded. Why did you suddenly ask this? I was thinking, the unknown corpses in that mausoleum, the gravekeeper who always remains quiet during the venture, who the hell are they? Vanna pondered thoughtfully. They are clearly not humans, nor of the real world. I know they're not gods or foul creatures of the subspace either, so why can a vision interact with the outside world and help us this way? And the lists, how is the owner of the tomb able to determine the criteria? Ads by PubFuture. Valentine waited until the lady finished her questions before issuing a long sigh. Then with an old and solemn face, this is your first time entering the tomb, and like many others, they too would have similar questions after they leave it. Unfortunately, we have no more answers than you after all these years. I remember that you also entered that mausoleum. Vanna turned her head and stared at the old bishop curiously. What information did you bring out back then? Is it also related to anomalies or visions? Not really. Valentine shook his head, although most of the time the mausoleum announces things related to the supernatural, but in actual fact, the owner of the tomb will occasionally convey meaningless messages. No one knows for sure what the message will be, and the only way is to enter the tomb. But one thing is certain, what the tomb owner says will always be true. Vanna didn't remove her gaze because she knew there was more to this juicy story. Then what information did you bring out that time? The old bishop got all troubled and tied inside. It wasn't something useful, just a prediction. The old bishop's evasive intention was obvious, but Vanna was a persistent lady. She could smell the prize. What exactly is it? The specifics. Valentine shot a helpless look at his younger compatriot and spread his hands. On the 7th month of the 24th, plans weather will be sunny with a 6 degrees difference in the southeast. Vanna. Quote. Don't look at me like that. Sometimes it's like that. Valentine facepalmed in embarrassment. Anomalies and visions are unpredictable, and this unpredictability will manifest itself in all kinds of places. I happen to catch one of those unpredictability. If you're going to laugh, then can you turn around at least? I'm getting too old. I'm sorry. Vanna's face stretched into a tense line of contorted laughing muscle. Quickly turning herself away from the old bishop, she silently giggled to her heart's content. But to be honest, I'm a little envious of you. At least your turn got enough information to know it's a sunny day. I, on the other hand, don't even know if the news is bad or good. On the edge of the upper city, in an older single-family house, Heidi, the psychologist, looked at her father with a slightly cramped expression. So, you visited the student's home 2 days ago and spent several hours chatting with the student's parents. From that meeting, you spent a total of 20 minutes talking about the student's situation. Then when you left, you paid more than 3,000 soles to buy an old dagger and a fake crystal pendant made of glass. Morris sat behind the table with the fake pendant sitting on top with the tag removed. He's sweating like a little child that's made a mistake. But the pendant didn't cost money, it's a giveaway. Ads by PubFuture. Isn't it more problematic for you to treat it as a birthday present for me? Heidi couldn't help but facepalm herself. You even pretended that you carefully selected this. Morris thought about the issue seriously before spreading his hand helplessly. I really can't find a second real thing in that store, so I had nothing else to pick. Heidi. After confronting each other for a few seconds, the daughter finally deflated. Forget it, it's not the first time anyway. Why do you always fall prey to scammers? I didn't suffer a loss this time. It was Mr. Duncan who suffered. Morris protested immediately. I bought the dagger for 20% cheaper than the market price. Heidi was shaking her head and sighing when she suddenly showed a stunned face after hearing the name. The owner of that antique store is called Duncan. Ah, yes, his name is Duncan, Morris said casually. It has always been rumored that he is an alcoholic plus gambler, but after actual contact, I found that it was really just a rumor. That harmful gossip is outrageous. The man is clearly a humorous and knowledgeable person. Huh, why do you have this face? Is there something wrong with the name? Heidi opened her mouth and hesitated for a moment before speaking. I have been in contact with a very tricky case recently, which happens to be related to this name. I got a little nervous when I heard it. This is a very common name, so don't fret. Morris nodded, but then he grew a little concerned. What kind of case is it? It's not your specialty, don't ask. It certainly can't be the same person anyway. Heidi waved her hand. Can a frightening ghost captain and a store owner who runs an antique shop in the lower city be the same person? Well, if you say it like that, Morris sighed with relief when he heard this. He knew his daughter often assisted City Hall and even the church in dealing with some dangerous cases as an advisor. Sometimes even related to the transcendent in rare occasions where her skill was needed. Relaxing his posture, he gazes down at the crystal pendant on the table. Then do you still want this pendant? Yes, of course I want. Heidi snatched the pendant on the table. It's not easy to get a gift from you, even if it is a giveaway. Morris pondered the issue again and suggested, actually, you can pretend that I bought you a pendant for more than 3,000 soles, and that dagger is a giveaway, if that helps. Heidi glanced at her father while putting the pendant around her neck. If you really did spend 3,000 soles on this scam, I will tie you to my treatment room for therapy. Chapter 107 Inches Super Contagious. The gentle waves slowly rose and fell while the vanished sailed across the surface of the boundless sea. After many days of this, the ancient ghost ship remains lost and can't find a beacon or island to pinpoint its location. There seems to be no end to the long, arduous journey. Nevertheless, its captain still has many things to do despite the woes. Duncan returned to the captain's bedroom, where the golden sun mask still lay quietly on the table. Alice's affair could come later since the Frost Rebellion happened half a century ago. It's not like he could investigate the topic at a whim either. Rather than chase a distant issue, he has a more pressing matter closely related to himself that he wants to attend to. Duncan raised his head and looked into the mirror hanging from the wall. The green flame that once coated the reflective surface has long since dissipated, and the distant scene that once appeared in the mirror was gone. However, Duncan could still faintly feel the faint and vague connection. It's still there, the channel pointing to the magnificent cathedral in the center of Plant. This connection gave him a similar feeling to his connection with the antique shop owner and the white oak, but far weaker, more ethereal. He had to admit, this was more like some secondary channel that was indirect and not under his whim. Duncan closed his eyes, allowing his consciousness to return to that dark space filled with countless starlights. At the same time, the brass compass hanging from Eye's neck also opened a gap, revealing the faint green flame inside. Unlike in the previous ventures, he did not perform a spirit walk, and maintained the critical state of entering and leaving to observe the flowing rays of light shooting across his view. Firstly, he immediately noticed the brightest star among the sea of lights, which pointed to the antique store and represented his other shell. That body was currently cleaning the warehouse and counting the goods in the inventory. Then through the hazy invisible mist of light, a much larger than normal starlight represented the white oak appeared. That's a connection he created by colliding with the steamboat with the vanished. Lastly, he found the faint and distinguished star that represented the newest addition. Duncan leaned over curiously, wanting to take a closer look at the cluster of stars surrounding it. But as soon as he got closer, he felt a subtle repulsion spreading out from the cluster of starlight. The force of this repulsion was not very strong. It seemed to be just a pure firm will to protect itself. Duncan believes that if he forcibly extends the ghost fire, he should be able to burn this subconscious protection down. But he immediately dropped the idea and kept his distance. The master behind this starlight should be the Inquisitor named Vanna, a storm saint, a powerful transcendent being. Reckless contact may alarm the owner, or worse, even the god standing behind the saint. Without knowing much about the gods of this world, Duncan was not yet ready to take the risk. On the other hand, this faint sense of rejection may also be a reminder to him that these stars have their differences. He didn't feel repulsion when he first occupied the shell of that sacrifice, and he didn't feel repulsion when he occupied the shell of the newly dead cultist, Ron, so why was there such repulsion around Vanna's starlight now? Is it because she is still alive? Or is it that everyone has an instinctive drive to resist erosion from outside forces? Or perhaps, her faith and blessing are sheltering her? Duncan stepped back a little, pondering the meaning of this discovery while trying to slowly extend his hand to the other cluster of starlight nearby. But he stopped at the last moment. There was no sense of rejection. Then he tried many more times at the other clusters, and each star never rejected his approach. Sometimes, he even sensed something new, an element. It's a vivid form of life, the instinctive trembling that cowers before the shadow of irresistible death. Returning to a corner of the dark area where the stars could not shine, Duncan rubbed his finger to summon a faint spark of the ghost flame. From the look of things, the increased number of times he spirit walked, the control and perception of this world increased as well. Now, he could even sense the existence of life from those starlights. Duncan frowned, then looked off into the distant darkness where mystique and wonder awaited. Out of caution, he had never explored beyond his means before, hence the misnomer that the starlights are all representations of corpses that had just died. But now, that's clearly not the case. There were not only the dead but also the living in these starlights. The Inquisitor, named Vanna, was also among these stars, and she was certainly a living person without a doubt. Does the countless starlight here represent all the living and dead in the world? Duncan furrowed his brow at the theory, wondering if that was plausible. But then he quickly shook his head to dismiss such an idea. It's too early to draw such a conclusion. Although there are a lot of stars here, although the population of this world is far less than on Earth, but within the scope of the eye, those starlights should not be able to match the population of this world. Besides, how would the stars define the number of the dead? There's also the white oak here, a ship without the essence of life. But regardless of how the starlight here connects to the real world, one thing is clear: the vast majority of starlight will not show repulsion to Duncan's approach, only the light of Vanna, the saint, has the self-protective response to him. Perhaps this is due to the God she believes in. Duncan now got interested in the power of faith. It's a powerful force, no doubt, but it also had a loophole he could exploit. Now then, there was only one question he had left to answer: when and how was this connection established? Duncan pondered carefully in the dark, thinking about what encounter he might have had with the Inquisitor to create this channel. After some elimination and speculation, he soon arrived at one extremely bold idea. Could it be that the first sacrifice that I possessed? Duncan recalled back to the first time he set foot on the land of Plant. He made a fuss at the venue and promptly left the scene shortly afterward. The event made it to the news as well. As it so happens, the paper reported that it was Inquisitor Vanna who oversaw the captured cultists who remained at the scene. Is that how? The more Duncan thought about it, the more plausible the theory got. He couldn't help but stare at his hands in amazement, stunned by how easily he managed to penetrate into someone of such authority. I might as well call myself the master of infections at this rate. I'm worse than those apocalyptic zombie films on Earth. Chapter 108 Inches The Illusory Scorching Sun. Duncan was now beginning to understand why the world would be so afraid of the vanished. Because, in a sense, this mobile natural disaster that was him and the ship really was like a plague. In a dark and chaotic space, Duncan quietly stared at the dancing flames in his hands, feeling the power contained in the fire that remained extremely docile to him. Fire is the most special existence in the world. It's not only a carrier of light and warmth but also a guarantee for the development of mortal civilization amid crises. The gods, blessing on the poor souls living in this challenging world. And like in most fields involving the supernatural, fire occupies a unique position and role. In this case, his ghost flames seem to faintly carry something exceptionally dangerous, a characteristic even the transcendence of this world couldn't defend against. From the currently known information alone, the ghost fire has the property of polluting and distorting supernatural items, could also be used to occupy the shell of the dead, and could hide in the souls of the living. Even the power of saints cannot completely remove it. As long as the right time is right, the flame will burn in the soul and establish a secret passage to the vanished. This was equivalent to a plague that's almost imperceptible and incapable of being eradicated. At least for now, the power of the so-called saints has little effect in the face of this flame. Duncan exhaled softly. Now he doesn't know when this weak connection between himself and Vanna would come in handy, but at least for now, it seems that with just the right medium, and some kind of opportunity, he could directly see and hear the situation around the saint. This was something he deduced after peeping from the mirror inside the lady's room, a scum and perverted move, but who's looking? As for what exactly would be the appropriate medium and opportunity, the former could temporarily determine that mirrors and flames are suitable carriers of projection, or in the professional term of the transcendence, they're called ritual props. Instead, it may connect them with the vanished. Duncan recalls the words he heard when the connection suddenly became established. The word vanished. Duncan had limited knowledge of the transcendence world, but when it came to names, it always held a special place in all the stories. And as it so happens, the name Duncan Abnomar in the vanished had power in this world. There was no need for further speculation. He's got the answer he wanted. The carrier was Vanna, and the activation key was the ship's name vanished. So long as there's a mirror or flame when the criteria are met, he would instantly get strengthened feedback from the Inquisitor and one-sidedly peep at the lady. Adds by PubFuture. The thoughts in his heart gradually calmed down, and Duncan also withdrew his gaze from the stars in the distance. He had no friction with the Storm Church or the young lady Inquisitor, therefore, he did not intend to use this connection to harm the other party or do nefarious acts. However, if this connection could bring him some valuable information every so often, then it's not a bad thing either. The dark and chaotic space and the sparkling light faded like flowing water, and Duncan opened his eyes again to find that he had returned to his bedroom. The golden mask, modeled after the sun, remains quietly there on the table with I napping next to it. He did send the bird to chat with the bored goat head earlier, but it appears the latter didn't like the company and sent her back. After a slight hesitation, Duncan reached out and picked up the sun mask. Although he had some hiccups and unexpected encounters along the way, but things are now finally back on track. It's time he studied this sun relic. He first flipped the mask back and forth several times to confirm the details of the shape and the specific material used. While examining the item, he suddenly noticed that a corner of the mask seemed to be chipped. The broken part faintly reveals a dark color. Duncan frowned, and in the next second, the pigeon that was still napping on the table before suddenly jerked open its eyes. With a flap of her wings in a loud chirp, copper plated. Copper plating on metal. As soon as Duncan heard the words from this dove's mouth, the chipped part on the mask instantly became more of an eyesore. Quickly picking the spot with his nail to study it further, he finally came to a conclusion that left his face defeated. It really is goddamn copper plated on iron. This thing is not even gold plated. The proof was the green spots in some areas. The mask has been rusting after spending time against the salty air. Isn't this a scam? The psychological gap between fortune to misfortune made Duncan lose his cool and mutter in disgust. He felt frustrated at the value of this mask. Whatever plan he had of reselling the sacred relic afterward just went out the window. Can they even do this? Isn't a sacred relic of a cult supposed to be precious and important? Even if it is a mass-produced one, but still. I rolled her eyes at Duncan's muttering, fluttered her wings and shouted, "Are you daft? How can you be so shameless?" Ads by PubFuture. Duncan took a long moment to arrive at an understanding of what the bird meant this time. She's clearly referring to the antique shop where it's filled with nothing but fakes. You shut up. The ghost captain mopes and deflates. After that, he stopped paying attention to the bird next to him and instead focused on the golden mask. Once confirmed the item was nothing but a worthless mass-produced thing of modern factories, he intended to go all out in his following tests. A cluster of faint green flames rose up at the fingertip, covering the surface of the mask like flowing water once he touched it. Then gradually, the ethereal green flame penetrated and seeped into the iron relic. Mass-produced holy relics are still holy relics. Even if the real material of this thing was iron and copper, the runes inscribed inside it aren't. Since the sun priests could use this thing to communicate with their god, it means that he too could analyze the secrets according to the properties of a supernatural item. Duncan has considerable experience in the field of transcendent objects, and his main experience was setting fire to Alice's coffin box. The most recent test proved to be most effective. Feeling the flames gradually invading the mask inside, Duncan also concentrated his mind and begun to perceive the information that this item might contain. This was a mass-produced thing, and its characteristics would certainly not be comparable to Alice's puppet coffin. Nevertheless, Duncan believes it wouldn't be long before he understood its function and secrets. Perhaps even reverse engineer the product and usurp it for his own use. With this thought, he spied deep into the mask for the truth. But in the next second, things quickly spiraled beyond his expectations. A thunderous explosion suddenly rocked his mind as if his intervention blew open a passage. As he pushed open the door, vast overflows of searing pictures poured outwards, causing him to wince in pain at the feeling. It might be just a second, maybe even shorter, but eventually, flashes about a fiery fireball appeared. It hung in the dark space alone, dead and unmoving like a corpse that's been forgotten for eons. This was a real burning sun constantly releasing a huge gravitational force of a stellar body. In the astonishing heat and tearing gravity, Duncan faced the scorching star. He did not burn under its might because what he saw was nothing more than a phantom of the past, a bygone era that's no longer relevant or dangerous to the present world. Duncan stared at this round burning orb in amazement until it eventually spun to the other side. Then, he saw it, the grotesque truth of this star. On the back of the sun, there are billions of dark, pale fleshly tentacles curled up and withered together. They made up the outline of a pupil that was partly closed in the manner of the deceased. Whatever living creature this false star was, it's obviously been dead for an unknown amount of time. Usurper of the flame, extinguish me, please. A faint, ethereal, even hallucinatory voice sounded in Duncan's ears. Chapter 109 Inches the Fire Usurper. A sudden sensation of a violent fall quickly stripped Duncan's spirit from the scorching creature. He didn't get to react at all when the grotesque giant left his view, but eventually, he found himself back in the chair of his captain's bedroom. The man's trembling, shaken by the sea of bloodied flame that's still fresh in his mind. After a few more seconds of silence and loss, he finally managed to calm his unsettled head to mutter the echoing words. Usurper of the flame, extinguish me, please. Duncan frowned, sure he had not misheard the whispering words. This is, that round, sun, conveying his wish to me. That thing detected my snooping and sent an SOS for help. Duncan rubbed his temple, contemplating the implications of this distress signal. Undoubtedly, that thing was what the followers of the ancient true sun worshipped, what they called the real sun. To be honest, in the brief moment when he first saw it, Duncan really felt a stir in his heart at how incredible the star appeared. However, no matter how amazing and incredible it looked from his angle, it was still not the sun he remembered from Earth. Sure, the front end appears exactly like the cosmic-powered stars he knew as an Earthling, blazing and burning, but the back side was a darn eyeball. Then Duncan recalled back to the pale and dull tentacles withered around the pupils. The creature, wrapped in the sun's shell, does not seem to be in very good condition. In truth, Duncan had no question of the creature being dead. There's an intense breath of death oozing out of the body. Even from a distance, the sense of lifelessness was undeniable. Adds by PubFuture. It was simply a burning corpse of an ancient god. And the corpse of the ancient god was asking him for help, hoping that someone could come and extinguish the flame on his body. It's a truly contradicting and horrific notion, but in a world without logic, this somehow seemed fitting. Duncan sorted out his confused thoughts little by little, recalling in that brief moment of voyeurism that he performed, another interesting point had popped up. That was, the sun called Duncan the usurper of the flame. Is that indescribable mass of flesh really calling out to me? Did it really sense my approach? Or is it just randomly murmuring out? If the cry for help was really addressed to himself though, then the intent and meaning couldn't be any more obvious. Duncan lowered his head and gently rubbed his fingers, watching a cluster of green flame burning quietly at the tip, ready to usurp the other paranormal powers out there. In the next second, he dispersed the ghost fire in his hand. Regardless of whether the sun was really speaking to himself, this was not something he could tackle as of now. The group of cultists in the planned city-state are still hiding in the shadows, and he has no ability or position to deal with the sun god behind the gang of cultists. What's more, how could he know how to help that burning sun? Rely on this little ghost fire to burn that big piece of thing. He couldn't burn it even if he exhausted himself. Besides, the other party was just asking for help from himself, which does not mean the thing was his own ally. God knows what will happen after extinguishing the fire on the sun's body. What if the flame was some kind of seal? What then? The giant creature wouldn't necessarily return the favor like a human would. In fact, based on the way the cultists acted, he's more worried the creature would destroy him after the act. It's simply not wise to casually deal with a god-like thing without knowledge. Duncan shook his head and sighed in his heart over how little he knew. Perhaps, I will never see the real sunshine in this world again. The golden mask, modeled after the sun, still rested quietly on the table, its surface a little dull after his little venture. Picking it up, he traced the shape's outlines with his fingertip until a faint cracking sound hit his ear. The item was made out of iron with a layer of copper on the surface. Yet, it had started to corrode and decay like it had been through a million years of weathering. Before Duncan knew it, the mask in his hand had disintegrated to dust. Adds by PubFuture. I jumped over, spreading her wings in front of Duncan and gesturing, happy, pop, gone. Duncan didn't care about the bird's nagging behavior because he had a vague understanding over the outcome. This mask was just a fake after all, a mass production holy relic. There's no way it wouldn't have side effects. Maybe I'll have to find a way to get the real thing in the future. Looking at the ashes floating in the air, Duncan said thoughtfully. This thing can't even burn for 3 seconds at this rate. He didn't really plan to save any sun god, but he was still quite interested in the secrets kept by the sun cultists. Moreover, he was also curious about the history before the Great Annihilation since he believed some extraordinary answer awaited him there. But as all researchers know, science requires great funding, and these cult sheep should be able to provide him with plenty of wool to sell. After a short break and regaining his spirit, Duncan left his bedroom. The goat head, who was in a daze at the mapping table, immediately turned his head when he heard the movement from the bedroom. He first confirmed whether the dove had come alone or not, then when he saw Duncan, the statue noticeably heaved a relieved sigh. "Ah, great captain, your most loyal first mate is here at your service and has kept a firm grip on the helm on your behalf. May I know if your long journey has gone well? I sensed your soul going off to a faraway place again, but it doesn't seem to be a city-state of humans. If you want to go far next time, you can actually in advance. How much do you know about the true sun god that those sun followers believe in?" Duncan waved his hand and asked bluntly. After getting along with this goat head for a while, he has become more and more graspful of the other party's temperament. Not only was Duncan more confident in his captain status, but he was also no longer as cautious when speaking with the statue unless it's directly related to the vanished. Everything else could be casually asked, like now. "Real sun god?" The goat head became startled for a moment and then hesitated. "Honestly, I don't know much. I only know that those followers of the sun god are crazy and stupid. As to the god's identity behind them, I don't have a clue. However, the blessing those mad fools get is indeed real. It does exist. It's the main reason their religion can spread so widely and far throughout the years." While speaking, the goat head gradually noticed the oddity. "Ah, why did you suddenly mention this? Did you just? I was just thinking, what would those believers do if they found out the so-called god they worshipped was in fact being roasted by them? Their effort and overtime to get the blessing is nothing more than the byproduct of the corpse oil that leaked out. Wouldn't that be ironic?" Duncan leisurely and confidently states, "Talk about one hell of a sadistic joke." A long silence swept across the mapping room, with the goat head not daring to follow up on that shocking subject. In the end, it was Duncan who broke the calm with an inquisitive look at the response. "Why aren't you talking? Normally you would be commenting on this and that by now." The goat head spoke with defeat. "The topic is too intense, I don't dare to add my opinion to it. I can only say the captain is wise." Duncan grew quite happy at one-upping the statue. He didn't know if it was an illusion on his part, but this goat head's evil and dangerous image no longer seemed so strong. In fact, everything on the ship was changing according to his perception. How to say it more lively and better? Chapter 110 Inches Coincidence. In the antique shop of the lower city, Duncan sits behind the counter with a weekly newspaper in his hand while reading the content. Suddenly, his eye blinked. Then from the somewhat dull eyes came a focused glint, followed by the fast flipping of the newspaper to the front page. The headlines on the front were marked by the recent events in the city-state. His Excellency Valentine, Bishop of the Storm Cathedral, would soon preside over a large-scale prayer. The other branches will also partake in the prayers and ring the bells and whistles to bless the city. And as a warm-up to this event, Administrator Dante Wayne congratulated the church on behalf of the city and offered various gifts last night. There's also the man's picture printed in the newspaper. It's a serious-looking middle-aged man with gray hair, tall and thin figure with a noticeable scar on his face. One of the eye was also replaced with a prosthetic one. That's clearly a mark of a near-fatal accident. Duncan's gaze slowly scanned the newspaper further and instinctively shifted the image in his mind to that of Inquisitor Vanna's face instead. The lady also had a striking scar on the face near the eye, which didn't affect the sight thankfully. According to what he knew, the city admin Dante Wayne was the uncle of the lady, and that both scars were the result of what happened 11 years ago. That's when the riot by the cultists happened and the factory leak at the 6th block. It's also the main reason both uncle and niece became such avid supporters of the Storm Church and actively fought to quell cult activities. They're also victims of those filths. This information wasn't a secret in the city-state, something that could be found in official records and folk rumors. That's how Duncan learned of it, by casually inquiring the neighbors and strangers. Another 11 years ago, and again the factory leak, in the 6th block. Duncan silently turned the newspaper to the next page, gathering and combing through the various details he had been collecting in the recent period. Fragments of the sun, the fire in his niece's memory, Nina's recent nightmares, the accident that happened to Inquisitor Vanna and Admin Dante, and the girl, Shirley, who seems to be investigating the truth and has an unknown origin. All these things revolved around the factory leak in the 6th block 11 years ago, and now the sun cultists are in the city again. He also learned of the sun god being a god-like creature that imitates a sun, and the thing was still seeking help from the outside. Duncan didn't intend to deal with the sun god yet, but he did get a little worried that this nameless fire might end up catching Nina and burning his niece when he was not watching. To remedy this, he had ordered I to scout the city early in the morning today, so it would be a while before the bird returned. As for Nina, the girl was busy packing her books upstairs right now to leave for school. It's getting lively in the morning with people passing his shop every second, a vitality he enjoyed. Ads by PubFuture. Uncle, I'm going to school. Nina rushes down the stairs while carrying her school bag over her shoulder. She also has a piece of bread prepared for lunch based on the wrapping he's able to see. Run slowly, don't fall. It's still early, you know. Duncan glanced at the girl helplessly and then remembered something. By the way, today is your day to visit the museum. Yes, I made an appointment with a classmate. Nina turned to face him with a bright smile. I won't come back to eat lunch and will go directly to the museum with my classmate. You find something to eat on your own, uncle. Got it? Duncan smiled and waved his hand, and slow down. Don't rush and pay attention to the cars on the road. Okay, goodbye, uncle. With the girl's crisp shout and brisk footsteps, followed by the jingle of the bell at the door, Nina's figure was gone and out of Duncan's sight. She crossed the road in front of the antique shop and raced into the morning light of planned. Alone again, Duncan recalled back to the previous home visit made by Mr. Morris and what was discussed. Nina had few friends at school, and most of her classmates didn't like to deal with her. But even if she has few friends, it seems that there are one or two classmates who have a good relationship with her. They're willing to invite her to the museum, so that's good. Nina also seems to be happy right now, which is of course a good sign. He inquired yesterday, and the classmate who was going to the museum with Nina was a quiet girl who also lived in the lower city. The two had only recently become friends and had a good relationship. Duncan put the newspaper in his hand down and mused about what to do next. There won't be anyone home until the evening, and today was another weekday, so there shouldn't be any business in the shop. It's a bit of a waste to stay here and look after the place when no one's going to visit. Maybe I can go around the city, and perhaps investigate something. First, sending an order to I's location so that the bird would continue her search while he went out, Duncan put on his coat and hung the temporary rest sign at the door before locking up the shop. There were many people at the bus station when he arrived due to the peak hours for people traveling to work and school. Mixing in easily with the crowd, he first looked up the routes at the map hanging from the wall. His destination today would be the 6th block where the factory leak occurred according to official records. Once he was sure of how to get there, Duncan withdrew his gaze and waited patiently in the crowd. Buses came and went, and several steam-powered buses took half of the people on the platform by the time his ride came around. The rumbling and bustling steam contraption didn't give him much sense of reassurance in case of a fire, but he's not one to judge. Ads by PubFuture. Duncan followed the large crowd into the car and quickly found himself squished between others. He didn't get a seat, of course. Those were mostly reserved for the kids and ladies. Ultimately, he pushed his way into a corner near the back door and waited patiently for the bus to start. The severely overloaded car started with the hoarse and laborious roar of the steam mechanism, a signal for the conductor to begin the difficult job of collecting the fares from the riders. By the time the conductor got to Duncan, the poor fella had already been through the washer in how messy his dark blue uniform had become. The 6th block, Duncan flashed a friendly smile to the conductor. However, the conductor was visibly stunned after hearing Duncan's answer and asked again to confirm, "Huh? Where are you going?" Duncan frowned. "The 6th block. I see the line is going that route. Isn't the bus going there?" The conductor was stunned again and then looked up at the road map posted on the carriage next to him. Quickly nodding like a dream, oh, of course, we are going there. It's just that no one usually goes there, so I forgot, 4 solas. Nobody usually goes to the 6th block. 11 years have passed since the incident, and the area around that factory has not been rebuilt. Duncan had some doubts in his heart, but he quietly bought the ticket and watched the conductor squeeze through the army of passengers like a warrior again. The next step was to wait silently for the bus to arrive at the destination. But at this moment, he suddenly felt a pair of eyes spying on him. It's brief and hardly more than a glance, but Duncan's sure it's not an accident. There's fear and a desire to dodge him based on his perception, which makes the ghost captain even more intrigued. In the next second, he saw a small figure trying to flee to the back of the sea of riders. Both of their eyes met in that instant, the latter freezing on the spot like a wooden statue. It was a girl in a black dress, who looked about the same age as Nina, and wore a peculiar collar around her neck with a small bell hanging from the collar. It's Shirley. Duncan slowly came to the other party like this and greeted the girl with a smile. We meet again. This time, are you going to school? Shirley somehow dared to squeeze out a smile there. Although she once said that she wanted to hug the big guy's thigh in front of the dog, but after realizing Duncan's horror, her smile had become uglier than crying. Hello.